Hello everybody, welcome back to another video. Today's video is going to be in 3D Studio Max, and it's going to be another chair. This video that I had found on my hard drive, I guess I never posted it, or it was just something that I recorded while I was doing it. But what I did was use this on a project for an interior scene. So what I do when I create chairs, and I've done one previously in my YouTube videos, is I usually use the rectangle inside of 3D Max, because for some reason I'm just not, I don't know, if over habit of not using the tape measure. If you're curious, like, why don't you use the tape measure? I don't know. I guess the boxes seem to be a better visual because I can actually make them into a proximity of where I need to be inside of. So that kind of helps me, because I'll kind of make a shell like what you see here, and then I'll build inside of that, so I kind of get a roundabout where I need to be. Given that I did make a box, I probably have the dimensions to this chair, but only one photo, because you would see more than one photo if I had more. But given a lot of the circumstances, either I couldn't find it online, or couldn't get close enough, or I figured it was easy enough to model. I modeled this chair in about an hour, is how long this video is, and the amount of time that it would have taken to search for that model on the internet and finding it and downloading and purchasing and everything else. When you factor all that time, it almost equals up to an hour. Or I can use the time as the hour goes and learn or get faster and sharpen my skills to get this done. Because what would happen if I get a model online, more likely the model is either going to have some issues or going to be not exactly where I need it, or UVs aren't created. At least here I know that I can actually incorporate what I want for this to work. And and for me, I can kind of factor how long something will take. When I look at this chair, I know it will take under an hour, or even less if I really wanted to press it and model a little bit faster to try to get something quicker. Sometimes going quicker leads to more mistakes, so just kind of keeping your pace usually works out in the end. What I'm doing here is doing a mirror instance so that I can model one side and don't have to worry about the other. Modeling this way keeps you from having to do it twice and keeping less error. So back to downloading from the internet. I usually mention, like, that's all good if you have a very complicated model and you found it online and everything else. But as time goes by and you don't do something often enough, your skills will start. It's kind of like learning. It's like practicing. Like baseball players going to swing, trying to hit the ball. You got to practice. A basketball player trying to shoot hoops. You don't just stop shooting hoops because you made it a few times in the previous year. You got to keep practicing. So this always keeps me on my toes and doing small chairs and stuff like this to keep that consistency going and not getting rusty as the years go by. Because if you don't do something often enough, you'll find out that you're just a little bit slower and a little bit off. And it's just like music. You got to practice the guitar every day to keep your skills sharp. And I feel like the same thing goes for 3D modeling. If you don't do it often enough, even box modeling like this is very simple modeling and basic, but at the same time it's very important to understand how your mind works. And it's kind of like Tetris and puzzle putting together, how you can divide something up and create it out of box modeling. As you can see here, I'm actually blocking out the model, pushing it to where I feel like to the edges of the seat and everything else. And I've done, I don't know how many chairs over the span of my career, but just going back thinking about it, I've done, I don't know, hundreds, just probably even more than that, and just furniture in general. That's usually where I found my happy spot, starting out in 3D doing architectural stuff. Like, I was happy just because before all of this Turbo Squid and everything else, really didn't have Turbo Squid. You had to rely on your skills. But now as the internet has evolved and everything, you can just go online, find a lot of models, but that also makes people lacking in skills to where they're not sharpening that axe. What this is right here to kind of show you, in case you're starting out modeling and stuff, what to look for. So usually if you see the model, you can break it up in pieces. You can see that top part of the chair is segmented and it's going to be pulled out, and the bottom part is going to be segmented and pushed back. You just kind of get the general shape. What I've always found is most things will go by, 4 inches out, 2 inches in, and it's usually rounded up to something like that, unless you get like something that's a little bit more half an inch up and down. But usually trying to keep your numbers rounded off, if you're using inches or whatever, usually helps. That way you can actually justify, this is 4 inches from the ground, this is 6 inches from the ground. From the back is probably a little lower, so we'll go 4 and then 6, and just going from there. Understanding that scale is going to be a big issue, because when I first started doing 3D, scale, you don't see it at first until somebody points out, like, that chair looks huge. Or even doing projects long enough to understand that if something is wrong, somebody's going to call it out. Like, why is that chair so big or so tiny? Sometimes there are tiny chairs. When I would put them in a scene for a client, that would be like, why is that chair so tiny? Well, those are the specs for the chair, and that's actually how small it is. So then they'll go back and reevaluate, is that the chair that they really want in that scene, to make the scene look a little bit off, because it doesn't fit that space. Some chairs are a little bit more bigger to fit spaces, so that the interior designers can get their idea across. There are some chairs that are taller that always look cartoony to me, but those are what was made. It swallows the people in the seat. So right here, I'm actually doing a cushion in the middle. If you break up the model into pieces, you're always going to have like a back cushion. You're going to have a base cushion on the bottom and a separate cushion to sit on. That's usually the cushion you pick up. And if you look at anything in your house, you probably got a cushion you can take off, and the other one's kind of attached to the chair. So I always try to use snapping tools. It's a good practice, but at the same time, sometimes imperfections help to sell your model at the same time. So snaps are good to a point, but then again, sometimes you got to make it a little bit chaotic. Like I say in most videos, nothing is perfect in real life, and so you gotta throw some things off a little bit in the end. Whether I do it here or if I throw it in ZBrush and try to do more details on top of this model, it varies. I don't think I threw this in ZBrush, so I'm pretty sure this was a short timeline or time frame for this chair. An hour is pretty reasonable given, like I said, how long it would have taken to find it online and go through the whole process of just purchasing something. And that's something you gotta factor, like how long does it take to do this, even just purchasing something. It takes time, and it adds up. If you did 5 models and you're trying to search for 5 models throughout the day, almost sometimes you won't find what you're looking for, or you're just spinning your wheels searching the web for something that you probably won't find. And usually I give myself a time frame if it comes down to that. How long I spend trying to find something, or can I make this quick enough? So as you develop skills or do this often enough, or even doing interior scenes, you'll get a kind of like an inner calculator in your head, or not a calculator, but a kind of a time frame in your head of how long things take. So I'm just pushing and pulling the cube around to kind of get a little bit general shape to match what the chair is showing in the reference. And so far, there's nothing fancy about this. This is just box modeling, and really all I'm doing is using the cut tool in 3D Max. Just use a slice, because as long as you have edge loops, it makes it a lot easier. If you start doing random triangulated cuts on your model. It could, sometimes it helps, but sometimes I just like keeping clean loops, edge loops, to where I can select an edge loop later on when I start doing subdivisions. I'll rarely try to do a triangle. If I do, it's just because that's either time or something just didn't add up to where I couldn't get it figured out, or I'll go back and fix it later, or it wasn't that big of a deal to go. So right here you're using a spline to kind of get an outline, I guess. And the good thing about a spline is that you can create it to be geometry and say wrap around with a, you know, a certain shape. So right here I'm trying to match all the geometry, and that spline will come in handy. Splines are interesting to me because you can do a lot with them, given if you need something to kind of smooth out or bend with like a curve kind of handle. So all this at the bottom doesn't really have to be perfect because we'll never see it. Really, there's no point in wasting time modeling things you won't see. I guess if you're doing something for like a game and you're going to do it where it's simulated and you're going to knock it over, yeah, I would model probably every bit of it. But for something like this, in a rendering that you're just from one camera to another, really I cut corners. I'm not going to model everything down there that you're going to worry about stitching and stuff like that. Or, you know, it really depends on what you're doing. But for architectural renderings, just the bare, what you see is pretty much usually good enough. So right now I'm just starting to cut the chair and getting things kind of situated in here. You can start to see where it's kind of coming together. Another thing is, I haven't rendered once. When you're, how do you explain that? When I first started doing 3D, and I mentioned this before, I was constantly going back to render, and that would take time. When you add up that time to render a preview, that'll add up. That's time that you could have just kept modeling and go back and fix it near the end when you need to render it. So right here, I'm using the rectangle to kind of sweep on the curve, and you can do modifications here and there. This is like what I was mentioning on the spline. Get a little Bezier handle at the end and just kind of do it like that curve. Or even do this, the flay the end or make it a little bit more smoother, and that's a little more accurate than me trying to do a handle. So, but back to rendering as I go, you'll notice that I'm really not rendering at all until probably the next part of this video, in this same video. But I try to get out of it's a weird habit to keep looking at rendering. Unless you're doing real time, then there's no time wasted there, right? That seems to be what things are coming to now, real time. And, just thinking back, even a few years ago, it was using a render farm. You had to have all these nodes to process one image because you had to get it out in so many hours because the deadline was the next day or something. Hoping that one of the computers didn't drop out and give you blacked out bucket to where you notice that something wasn't right, and you're like, oh, just one of these didn't kick in. That seems, hopefully we push away from that kind of work method, because the real-time thing is pretty cool, being able to render it instantly and seeing how it looks. But I feel like as the years go by, it'll probably improve, and you won't even know. I'll be the person saying, back in my day, we used to use render farms, you know. We used to walk through snow to get to school, but for this, it was just, yeah, it's not a bad thing to keep going forward and would not have to go through that process. So making sure that my pivot is set at 0 so I can mirror it, and that way it's kind of perfectly aligned. Now you can actually see that the chair is kind of coming, it's almost there. What I'm going to do is pretty much subdivide, and I will pretty much use the subdivision and grab a spline out of it and create kind of like the little, what do you call it, that stitching edge that goes around the chair. It's just a little detail, but it kind of helps to do it as a separate one, because you can always use that as a different texturing map and even offset the colors, because sometimes they'll do them a darker color. As you can see in that rendering, it's a little bit, you can see the outline of it. And so when doing box modeling and doing subdivisions, you're going to want to, I usually use the interactive what do you call it on there, mesh smooth or whatever it's called inside of the edit poly, because you can actually interactively do it. And I made it to a hotkey in 3D Max so where I could just toggle back and forth and not have to go into the modifier stack and actually take a few minutes or seconds to go click something and go back and forth. I'm all for the fewer clicks the better. If I can make a button to do it that takes away 5 clicks, you know, great. Oftentimes when I do the smoothing, I grab the center polygon and push it up or down to kind of give it a little bit more of a softer feel. And you can do it right here in the middle, in the front, to actually make it a little bit more cushiony. Because if you don't, it looks uncomfortable. And when you're trying to put it in a scene and sell an image, comfort is key to a lot of these pictures, because people are like, that chair looks so uncomfortable. If you make it look very, you know, like, man, I want to sit in that chair, then, you know, you won. Unless the design doesn't ask for that and you're like, I'm trying, but the design is really a hard looking chair. And there are chairs that are very uncomfortable when you sit in them. You're just like, geez, who wants to sit in this thing? I have to readjust my back to sit down in these things. So you can see that I'm just making cuts to kind of fill in to where I want a little bit more creased areas. And you can see right here the cushion is actually like peeking over the edge, and I'm like a little bit down. We're gonna push it down. So as you just go along, you'll be able to see where you need to adjust things. But this is a fun process to me to model in this way. It's kind of like you can't get those zoned out, just focused. You'll realize that, you know, time goes by a little bit faster when you're just in this little bit of a zone modeling. Goes for a lot of things in 3D. Sometimes you're just zone out. It's kind of like drawing. You just find that happy spot and just go with it and keep on modeling. So right here I'm trying to get a crease on the chair to where it's got like that hard edge. So you'll push the edges a little bit closer together and go down. This method will work in other programs. If you were going to model in ZBrush or even other programs like Blender, this technique should work in every other program. Some of the way it processes it might be a little different, and there's ways to set those up to be a little different to go back and forth. But on here, you can see I'm just subdividing, making it even in the middle and pushing it in and out into where I want it to feel a little bit more comfortable. If you do an edge loop and then you push on the normals, usually you can get the inner cushion to be a little bit more softer in the inner edges, and where it's a little more consistent. This is a separate mesh at the bottom that I'm just subdividing and pushing up and around. Same thing, probably make it a little bit more comfortable. Just a little bit sometimes is all you need. Sometimes you might need a little bit more exaggerated feel. Really depends on your client and what they ask for, because they'll be like, there's something not right, or you might have to exaggerate something sometimes, and where they're trying to sell their idea of anything and probably don't care how the chair looks. So it's just back and forth. Everybody's different. As long as they're happy, then it's all good. Or if this is your own design, whatever makes you happy, I guess, in the end, to get it right. So right now it's just kind of pushing and pulling vertices and just kind of getting a little bit closer, a little bit more accurate. This here in the back, same thing. And it's got two little buttons you can barely see in that reference. I'm going to try to put a point on the button area and go from there. And then try to pull out the polygons around it to give it a little bit more so you can see it. And then I'll probably put like I don't know if I did it in this video. This is a playback. And most of these are pretty similar to doing that. I figured I'd just get this video out online because it's on my hard drive. Might as well share it. If there's anything that you pick up on and see, like, oh, that's cool. What I found out through the years is that everybody models their own way. And no matter who it is, if you find something that somebody does, you're just like, oh. And even sometimes I'll go back in videos that I've modeled something, and I ask myself, I wouldn't do that, would I? And at the time, I'm like, there's some times where I'll do something where it's just out of character. I know what I do, but sometimes you look at it and you're like, I usually don't do that, but I did it there, and I was like, okay, I guess I did do that. Because sometimes you just, either you're going to try something new as far as 3D goes, because that's always a learning experience going forward. You're always trying to learn to do something a little bit quicker, a little different. And I found out that whenever I go throughout doing 3D, sometimes I'll try something different. Even here, that cut that I just did, I normally probably wouldn't have done, but just to see if it did work, then I did it. So I might even weld them together to see if I can get it to smooth out, because yeah, it's not looking comfortable, it's not looking accurate. And so you can see right here, I'm pushing things back and forth, trying to smooth it out, trying to get a little bit more natural. But yeah, that's part of learning when you do 3D, even modeling, box modeling like this. You're always finding new techniques, and you're like, oh, that works, and I should use that more often. So right here, I'm actually trying to soften the crease of the model on here, and there's a little time for experimentation usually when you're doing a model, knowing within a time frame, because if you spend another hour just trying to figure something out as a new technique, it's probably gonna be a waste of time. It's probably better to just kind of learn it another day and carry on with what you know, because there are times where you're like, it's gotta work, but if you don't have the technique down, it's kind of like, let's see, I guess it's kind of like playing a new song for a band. If you're gonna say, I'm gonna try this new song, and you're like, or I guess if they're comedians trying to see if a joke works, it goes through a lot of things in life. Experimentation and learning as you go. But that does, promote, growth and learning. That saying goes of learning how not to do something. You learn from your failures. And that's a lot of how you gain experience. You learn how not to do something, going along and doing something like this. Or you also find the bugs, and then you're like, oh, I'm never going to do that again, because that actually made a crash instantly. And we've all been there if you've done 3D for a good amount of time. Or if you're just starting, you'll realize that there are bugs in a program and that you probably shouldn't cross the streams whenever you come to that point, because it could be bad. Kind of learned what not to do to avoid those points where you're like, oh man, that just crashes every time I push these two buttons in order. And we all been there. But just getting around to creasing this model, And this is getting pretty close to almost a little more than halfway as far as this chair goes. A lot of it's just kind of polishing it off. Now it's just kind of like a beauty pass, and I'm gonna still put those threads at the edges of the cushions. But you really can't. You can do it, but if you do it and you want to make an adjustment, then you got to go and redo those. So it's kind of good to get your silhouette, so to speak, of your model set in stone first before you start going and put that last icing on the cake when you do this. And even here, if this chair was like in the very background of a scene and you're not going to get very close to it, this could work. You could be like, well, it's pretty close to something that I need. Looking at it now, that arm needs a little bit more swooping to it. And I don't know if I correct it or if I just kind of overlook it. But sometimes when you're standing too close, to the forest, or that saying goes, we're standing too close to the trees to see the forest. Sometimes you gotta back out. Kind of like whenever artists would flip their canvas and mirror it, just kind of see what your brain will pick up on things differently when you flip things around. And that's not so much on this because it's symmetrical. So right here you can see that I'm using the spline to extract out of the mesh, subdivided mesh, and I'm gonna create just a mirror of that and go from it. These are small details. What I like about the spline is that I can actually scale the thickness of this wraparound spline. And if it doesn't read from a distance, I can always make it bigger. This was always like a small little detail that kind of helps. I used to try to model it inside of the base mesh of the cushion, but that always ended up in like a little bit more frustration. And over the years, I just figured make a separate spline, that way I can edit it. Because if you're trying to edit it on that base mesh to inflate it and make it up and down, just do this. Unless you're gonna zoom in like to a microscopic level, then that's a different process. But like I said, for an architectural rendering, you're not gonna zoom in. These are just gonna be pixels on the screen once you're done. I do this for all the cushions, and even here I'm pushing and pulling some of the vertices to kind of give a little bit more random chaos. Like I said, like if it's too perfect, you'll know, but every now and then I got a little time to push a little bit more detail and make it a little bit more. So you can see right here, it's just a little off, and that's okay because your brain picks up on these things. Your the computer in your head runs a little bit all the time, and it's always thinking. And you'll realize that. It even comes to whenever you're drawing a human figure, when you see it and you're like, something's not right. Those eyes look weird, or that nose is off, or the symmetry's not right. Even the furniture, it comes back to that. Something will be off. Your brain picks up on it. So this is probably the first time I opened the material editor, and you can tell that given the time frame, I probably was in a hurry to model this chair, and all I wanted to do was get it out. And so slapping a basic material and putting a 2x2 or 4x4 UVW map is usually a quick way to get it wrapped, or just text UV mapped, to actually just get a repeating fabric on it or something. And this seems to work sometimes whenever you're doing textures like this. So I'm looking at the model and seeing that there's a connection in the middle. I was like, oh, so what I gotta do is just I don't know if I connect it or if let's see what happens here. Not sure what I was doing right there. Oh, so what I was gonna do was create a spline to kind of give a ruler, 3D ruler, I guess. Anything straight, give me an idea of where to cut. sometimes I use just a spline and snap it to an edge and say, all right, this is close enough to measure. I'm still against the ruler. Even here you can tell, like, he doesn't want to use a ruler no matter what. He's going to use something else. So even that cut, just cut across. I guess I'm going to connect it all and just go an easy route. And my thinking is that there was a deadline for this and it needed to be done very quickly. So this is an older video. I think this is probably a year old. Like I said, I was just going on my hard drive. I was like, what's this video? I was like, oh yeah, it was a chair that I modeled. So you can tell right here, you're really not going to look down. And I don't have a picture of the back, so I'm pretty sure there's a support going from one end to the other, because this chair won't be able to support itself. And so probably what I do is just bridge two polygons or extrude a polygon down the middle and then call it a day. So just grab the first two I see and extrude and go to center, zero it out, and there you go. Really not much else to it unless we're gonna like get real specific about it. And I don't think I had a full photo references for the back. A lot of times working with interior models, you only get one photo and it'll be like, we need this. We need this. You can do one method to do is just put it in Google search images, and I found out that if you do search by image, you can kind of get something close. But if it's something that's just so rare, you might find a picture, but if you don't, then you're like, oh, this was a photo of, I don't know, sometimes it won't pull up. There's a rare occasions like that, and that's why I always say keep your axe sharp, grind the axe. There's nothing wrong with it. You the benefit is that your skills keep up to date, and you're not getting rusty at the same time. So right now I'm just kind of just those little bit of pushing and pulling. You look at it and you're like, man, that looks a little bit off right there. And this is where that symmetrical modeling comes in. This works in other programs, like I said. If it's not named, every program names something different. They're gonna call it a different name. But as long as you find the accurate naming, then you should be okay. So right here you can actually see where I selected the edge loop in the center, and I want to scale based on the normals, and so this usually helps. Except I didn't want it on the back, and I just wanted to kind of push a little bit more of that cushion feel. And this is kind of what I was mentioning earlier of grabbing the inner set and extruding out. Extruding or pushing by normal. I think push by normal is probably the best method, or just eyeball it. Because really I want it to just be a little bit more softer. That little bit helps. That little bit counts to me when you look at models. Just that little touch. So as you can tell, I still haven't pressed render at all. I probably have the scene set up for that, or we'll find out in a minute. If I don't have a sun in the scene, then that means I didn't even try to render at all. Right here, you can see I'm going to grab the edges and do a loop, and then extract that spline, and then create it just like I did the other cushion. Like I said, this was years of headache trying to model it, and just figured out why am I going to do it the hard way? Work smarter, not harder, right? And so that's what's kind of going on here. And I like this also, the splines. You can also increase your steps inside of that and just kind of optimize it. Because if you don't need all those polygons, why not save a few polygons, to not waste resources? Because we're all trying to get to a finish line, whether that be a deadline or anything. You're trying to get something done quickly at the end of the day. And as long as you can keep going get momentum going, it's all good. So right here, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm probably going to grab that spline and another spline, because if you look at a cushion, you'll notice that there's either two of them or just one that meets to a point. And if you start looking around at your furniture, or even go to like a store, go to a furniture store and just start looking at how things are made. If this is something that you're going to start doing, architectural renderings or interior renderings and stuff like that, it doesn't help it does not hurt to go to the store and go just look around, because that's almost the same thing as stepping out in nature and getting inspired whenever you're going to do some like concept art and stuff like that. And it still doesn't hurt to go out in nature, even if you're not going to do concept art. It's still just good for your brain, good for the soul. So getting outside is always good. Get some of that sunlight on your body, make it healthier, But here you go. This is probably the first time I'm pressing render. I have a basic material on there. It looks like it's just a gray, and just kind of going from there. And I have some kind of real quick settings that I'll probably just throw on there. I did have like an HDR map that I always used, and I just toss that in the environment and then press render. It's not real high res, it's just a low res one that I found online, and I liked it because it was just like a basic setup, and you don't really have to do too much to it. You just put it in there and push render. As with most renders nowadays, are coming along with spherical sky domes and stuff like that, to get that mimicked look of what you're trying to achieve. When you're rendering with the HDR environment, you want to kind of keep it neutral if you're going to start doing interior design, because that's going to affect the palette of what the textures come out as across. And this was just a black and white sterile environment, and I feel like this is the easiest to kind of get a read. So this is probably the first render. You can see the cushion needs a little bit of pushing on the front, but then again, the render kind of has like a heavy lip to it too. But within, if you factor the time frame, it's almost been, let's say the timestamp is almost at 40 minutes, and so we're a little under an hour for creating this, so that's pretty good. Unless you already had the model supplied, then this route doesn't hurt, because every now and then you'll get a model, and even then I've even had this where like people or clients and stuff, or whoever you're working with will actually have the model. They're like, I got the model from the website, and you get the model, and yeah, you got a model, but the model, sometimes it's not even accurate. Sometimes it's very tessellated, messy. Sometimes putting a UV map or even just anything on it just kills it. Faces aren't attached. You can tell that it was like very scary to work with, and I've had that to where it's just like, and it's almost better to start over and just use that as a template and rebuild it. And that could have happened with this chair, who knows? But I've had that happen a lot, to where folks will be like, I've got the model, and you're like, cool, and you cross your fingers. You're like, don't be horrible geometry. And then because the tricky part is when either whoever you're working with, or whether it be a client or your partner, or even the people who are handing you the information, when they hand you a model, that automatically assumes that you're going to get it done in half the time, because they supplied half the work. And that's not always the case, because a lot of times what happens is that you're trying to explain that the model was bad, you couldn't work with it, and they're like, well, we got it from their website. Well, the website doesn't always mean that it's going to be perfect either, because the website's almost going to be just for inserting in through their Revit plan, and just for space, almost, in a way. I've always found that some of the models, if they're more complicated, that the worse the models come across. And so That's why it's always good to actually keep this part of your skill set sharp, because you're going to encounter that if you start doing a lot of interior design work or interior renderings. You're just like, you'll encounter this a few times throughout doing that kind of work. Or sometimes you just try to make that model work and go from there and just like, all right, and throw it in there. And if they're like, well, why does it look so bad? Like, well, that's just bad geometry from what you gave me, to kind of show exactly what's going on, and actually know that you're going to refine it as you go along to meet the deadline. Because sometimes there's no time, and then you have to throw in whatever was given. And there's that part too, to where then they'll ask you whether you can fix it or remodel it too. But a lot of times in the back of your mind, if you got the time, you'll know if you can fix it up quick enough. Every now and then it'll be just like a cushion, but sometimes I'll find out whenever it's like some weird parts and that's weird triangulations that are like Frankenstein. And when I say Frankenstein, you'll know what I mean. But this is near the end of this video, so hope it was informative. Maybe you learned something from this. I have another chair model that's online on the channel, but this is pretty much most of it, besides adding a texture and going from there. So I appreciate you watching. Hopefully you'll check out the other videos I posted, and I'll try to continue. If I find other videos, I'll throw them back on this channel, and hopefully we all can learn from my mistakes or what I've learned or going forward. But this is very straightforward box modeling of a chair, and with under an hour and going about 42 minutes of modeling a chair, and we are now done. We can now group it or add a texture or whatever we want to it. So thanks again for watching, and have a good day.